We will get going for today. So, with this practice of mindfulness, is paying attention on purpose in the present moment with non-judgment. The whole reason why we practice this mindfulness is to give us greater flexibility. So we're not stuck. We're not just trapped in our normal way of doing things, but we have options. There's a fluidity in the way that we can relate to our experience. We've talked a little bit about, how we can relate to that experience in different levels. There's that observing, just like letting things come through. There's labeling, being able to put the labels on it and just say, this is what that is, this is what that is, that's what that is. And then that participating, where it's that paying attention to what it evokes in you. And, we were talking about how, sometimes just the observing part can be the trickiest one for most of us. And that, for us to really just allow things to flow in and flow out without grabbing onto them, without having to label them, can be so hard. And it's one of the most useful skills in reducing our reactivity. So reactivity is that sense when you've been hooked. It's like this, what it feels like for me. I feel like a fish on a hook. It's like I just know I can't get free. I'm stuck in something. I've been hooked by a situation, or I'm just stuck, and I just can feel all of the energy just kind of bubbling up inside of me. And that ability to just observe, to let things to kind of flow in and flow out, to have that fluidity and that flexibility, reduces the effect of getting hooked and that feeling of just being able to unhook a little bit easier. So I was thinking that we could spend a little bit more time working on this observing quality and allowing a little bit more of the fluidity and the flow without trying to grab onto something in our mindfulness, because that's just our natural habit. We want to focus in. Another way you can think about this is having that, difference between a really narrow focused, a sharp, close focus, and more of a wide angle focus, that soft focus. Either way is fine, but they give us different information. And having a wide angle view, that soft focus, allows things to flow in and out a little bit more fluidly, so that there's a little bit less reactivity to our surroundings, the events around us, reactivity to our own thoughts. I think my own thoughts get me wild going more than anything else, and how I'm thinking about stuff or how I get hooked. So one of the ways that we can work on this wide angle view of just observing is actually beginning to notice the space between. So a lot of times we focus on an object. It's like we're going to be mindful of an object, or we just naturally focus on things. The computer in front of me, the screen in front of me, the car that I'm driving, the tree that I pass as I'm walking out there. We notice the things. It's very interesting to start noticing the space between things. It's just that little bit of a shift that makes your brain kind of stutter a little bit, like, what? How does that go again? It's like I normally go from this thing to this thing to this thing. I kind of skip over the space in between things. And so I really challenge you, next time you go on a walk outside, notice the space between trees. Notice the space around a house. Notice the space on the other side of the car. Just that little bit of a shift of instead of focusing on the object in front of you, notice the space around it. And even right now, you can even put your hands out in front of you and notice how you normally just look at your hands. And even that little bit of there's a little bit of a mind jump, when you look at just the space in between your hands, the eyes kind of have to soften a little bit to notice the space between. There's just that little bit of soft focus where everything just kind of gentles out a little bit, and rather than grabbing from this hand to this hand. And we can do this with sight. We can do it with sound, with touch. It's really interesting to listen to the silences in between sounds. And we'll play with that in our meditation today. It's like, even as I'm talking, there are the words we normally attach to the words, but then there's the space between the words, the quiet in between the words. And your brain has to just soften just a little bit to notice that quiet, the silence in between the sounds. And, just kind of taking this a little bit further, a little bit deeper, this allows us to notice the space between thoughts, the space between the internal words. Normally the thoughts are like blah 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 blah. There's not even a gasp of air, for the thoughts. It's just like continually throwing out another thought, another thread, and keeps going. And yet, even in our thoughts, we usually think in words. There's spaces between the words. There's spaces between this blah of thoughts and this whole yarn ball of tangled mess. And then there is almost that sense of like, okay, and then I go on to the next one. So there are little pauses in between the thoughts, in between the words and the thoughts, that if we notice those, it allows us to, again, have that little bit of soft focus in the thinking, where I'm not quite so grabbed onto this particular thought. And the more I practice that, the more the thoughts can just come and go. It's just like air coming in and out, and just sound coming in and out. But it's just noticing the space between sounds, space between thoughts. Even in emotions come in pulses. I remember when I first was learning about the physiology, with just the electrochemical impulse of an emotion, it lasts about 90 seconds. I'm like, maybe yours does. Mine lasts more like 3 hours. But our thoughts are what actually loop back in and send out another pulse of emotion. And then the thought comes out again and it puts out another pulse of emotion. And so it keeps going. And we normally don't realize this interplay between emotions and thoughts and the pulsing that happens. So it just feels like it's one large big thing. But if we really start to notice, there are these little pulses. Sometimes it's like a rise and a crest, and then it falls down. And it takes, maybe 20 minutes of these little pulses building up, and then it comes down. But maybe even beginning to notice the ebb and flow in emotional pulses that are happening inside and the intensity. We can definitely do this with physical sensations. Pain often comes in these pulses and these waves. And sometimes even just beginning to notice the pause in the pulse can make that pain relax a little bit more too. A lot of times, I notice, the pain starts to come down. I'm like, oh, thank goodness, finally, I got a break. But then I'm already tensing up for the next one because I'm focusing on the object, the pulse of pain, rather than the space between the pulses. So again, it's just focusing on that space between. You have to soften the gaze a little bit. You have to soften the awareness a little bit, because there's nothing to really grab onto. It's space. And so there's more just this widening of just noticing the beginning and the ending of one and the other, and then there's this space in between. So we're going to play with that. And again, just kind of noticing for yourself that this is tricky. It goes against what our brains naturally want to do. Our brains naturally want to focus on the thing. So, just acknowledging it's going to take a little bit of playing around, and that's okay. It's play. So with that, we'll go ahead and start our exercise. Hmm. So as we begin, allowing that a breath, allowing that attention, noticing where you are right now in this moment. Maybe breathing a little bit more deliberately here at the beginning, just so that you can feel that breath. Noticing the air right there at your nose as you breathe. Noticing the way the muscles just right there in your cheeks and your soft palate will move just a little bit with the inhale and the exhale. Following that breath down into your chest. Noticing your shoulder blades in your back, right there at the top of your chest. Noticing that little movement right there at the top. You can almost feel an up and down movement as I breathe. And noticing the front of your chest, your collarbones, your upper ribs. Noticing how your ribs will pull open ever so slightly as you inhale. Relaxing back down with the exhale. Allowing that attention to come into the breath, even as the mind wanders, because that's just what minds do. And every time you notice it, you just gently redirect it back to the breath. Perhaps breathing down into your lower lungs, all the way down there into the sides, feeling the ribs expand out to the side as you breathe. The breath pulling down into the belly, breathing all the way down to the belly with your inhale, relaxing with the exhale. And just giving your brain that time to switch in when it's been busy doing and focusing outwards. And just beginning with the breath, noticing that rhythm of the inhale, and then the pause, and then the exhale, and perhaps a pause there at the bottom of the exhale. Each breath makes a cycle, an inhale, and then down the exhale, and that little space between before it begins that next inhale. And so that's where we begin to play an experiment, noticing the inhale, noticing the exhale, but then staying with the pause. Then, almost as if you can just let the inhale and exhale happen all on their own. They don't need your help. The breathing just happens. Seeing if you can stay right there at the pause, that space, at the end of the exhale before the inhale begins again. Sometimes it feels like I'm chasing after the inhale, like, wait, come back. I have to follow that. I have to pay attention to what my inhale feels like. Almost as if that pause in between is just kind of like waiting, watching, noticing. And then the inhale happens again. And then the exhale. Just watching that pause. And sometimes it can be really disorienting. You're like, watch what? What am I supposed to be paying attention to? Nothing's moving. So that's okay. It is just that weird little shift. Allowing the brain to just relax just a little bit. That attention to widen out just a bit. So it doesn't grab quite so tightly onto following the inhale and the exhale. But just the pause there. Sometimes it's almost like my brain has to put something in there, so it wants to put a little like I got there. And then the inhale and the exhale start up again. So no judging, just noticing. Noticing the space between the breaths. And then shifting that awareness to notice sound. So you're hearing my voice. You're hearing the words that I say. Your brain is processing the information that you're hearing. And see if you can almost relax that paying attention to what I am saying. And notice that space between sounds. You might need to let your awareness stay with the whole sentence and almost that at the pause. Or you might be able to just start noticing a word and a pause and a word and a pause. Those little tiny spaces between words where you start to not even pay attention to what is being said. It's just sound, sound coming in, sound coming out. And of course, the brain wants to grab onto something because that's just what we're trained to do. So that pause can be really difficult to notice, and that's okay. Just experimenting, just playing, just starting to become aware of the space between sound. And then perhaps taking that internally, noticing the thoughts that are happening right now. You might be noticing, there's a thought, there's another thought, there's a whole string of thoughts. Again, just that stepping back to observe and notice. Here's a thought. Maybe there's a small little space before the next thought happens, or maybe not. But just that slow type of relaxing of awareness, the gentle, soft focus. Let's that space between thoughts get a little bit closer. And you might just go back to noticing thoughts and just labeling. There's a thought. There's another thought. There's another thought. And then going back to trying to see the space between the labels. As you label a thought, there's a little tiny gap. And then another thought that you label. And then another little tiny gap. It's just kind of going back and forth, back and forth. Noticing the object, then noticing the space. Noticing the thought, then noticing the space. And sometimes it feels like my brain starts to hurt. And it's trying so hard to find those little spaces. And whenever you notice that you're forcing or trying and you can't quite grasp it, then you come back to your breath, the inhale and the exhale, and almost just that, phew, just let it go. Let it come and it goes. The thoughts come and they go. The space comes and goes. The sound comes and goes. The space between sound comes and goes. And I can just stay right here in the breath. And then letting all of your attention come back to your breathing. Really feeling that inhale and the exhale. Taking a moment to just savor breathing. Maybe breathing all the way down to the belly. Savoring a nice long exhale. Taking a few more breaths. And when you feel ready, opening your eyes.